when you're looking then at modern day characters, I mean, Eubank is a great example of this. Sky Sports essentially took, I don't think they did it consciously, but they looked at the way that boxes were being sold, if you like, in the 1920s. And they applied that to Chris Eubank. He was a massive marketing ploy in the 1990s. I mean, I'm sitting in my mum's house at the moment, and I remember putting a satellite dish on the roof of this house so that my granddad could watch Chris Eubank lose.
Hello, and welcome to Your Play or Mine, the only podcast out there that is combining the worlds of the creative arts and sport in one show. I'm your host, Sarah Mackenzie Foley, and this is Season 1, Episode 5. If you are stumbling across this podcast for the very first time, I would highly recommend going back after listening to this episode and having listened all the way through from Episode 1, because I've had a truly fantastic list of guests, and I have no doubt that you'll enjoy listening to them as much as I've enjoyed talking to them. Speaking of which, my guest for this episode is director Andrew Gallimore, who you might know as the director of the feature-length documentary One Night in Millstreet, which chronicles the iconic 1995 super middleweight world championship boxing bout between Steve Collins and Chris Eubank. I had the pleasure of seeing the film at the Cork International Film Festival where it had its premiere, so it was really special for me to get the chance to speak to Andrew and pick his brain about boxing and sport in general. So without further ado, here is the latest episode of Your Play or Mine with Andrew Gallimore. Enjoy. Andrew, you are very welcome to Your Play or Mine. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. It's kind of I'm actually back in Wales for a few days, and it's nice and warm, and it's all good. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, you'll have to bring some of that back whenever you eventually return, because it's not the best here, but we're doing our best. It's great to have you on the podcast. I suppose for those who aren't familiar maybe with the show, we always kick off with the same 3 kick-off questions for each guest. And I always love to ask people, what's your very first sporting memory?
Well, that's an easy one. I mean, I remember being taken by my dad to Cardiff Arms Park, as it was then, to watch Wales play rugby. And it was mad. This was the 1970s. And Wales basically didn't lose in Cardiff throughout the 1970s. And I thought that's how sport was. It was great. You just went and you watched somebody win and you went home. It was excellent.
I love that. That was because the 70s was Willie John McBride, right?
It was, yeah. And I mean, funnily enough, it was sort of at least, probably 30 years after the fact. I actually did a history of Irish rugby for TGCAT and got to interview Willie John McBride. It was crazy. It was like kind of seeing your childhood from a different perspective.
Yeah, I love that. I was at the, not called the Millennium Stadium anymore, but at the time I was there when Munster won their second Heineken Cup final, and it's still the best rugby atmosphere I've ever experienced, as Cardiff was just incredible. So I can relate to that definitely. I suppose then it kind of ties in with the next one, which is, who is your personal sporting greatest of all time, whatever sport you'd like to take them from?
It's an interesting question, that, because I'm always kind of loath, really. I mean, even if you take boxing, I mean, you look at somebody like Jack Dempsey, for example, who's the heavyweight champion in the 20s. And if you read the writing around that, people just thought this guy was a Superman. Nobody would ever be able to beat him. But if you look at him these days and compare his size to the physical size of heavyweight boxers today, he wouldn't be able to compete, and so it's really difficult. So I suppose that's a way of answering the question. My greatest of all time actually would be a football manager, and I think it's because of, if you can't compare people's performances, and I don't think you can, I think the only way of doing it is to look at legacy. And I think if you look at legacy, for me, because I'm a massive Liverpool football fan, I think that Bill Shankly is the greatest of all time. I think that if you look at football today, even as massive as it is globally, he built and created a club in his own image. Now, managers have come and gone people have won more than he did. But ultimately, the DNA of that club is still essentially Bill Shankly. And I think that as somebody who's left a lasting legacy, I can't really think of anybody who has sort of outlived his time in the way that he has.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a great reference because obviously we've just heard that Jurgen Klopp is retiring rather than going to another club after Liverpool. So he's obviously very dearly loved as well there. But yeah, that's a really good shout, kind of going back to the DNA of a club like that, looking to where it's come to now. I'm curious now to know whether the answer to the next question is going to be based on boxing, rugby, or soccer, because we've gone through three different sports. What's the most emotional sporting moment you've ever experienced as a spectator?
I'll tell you what, I'll give you rugby and soccer, right?
Amazing.
So, emotional, good. Liverpool beating Milan in 2005, Istanbul, can't beat it. I mean, for sporting drama, that was just the best. And I think the counterpoint to that actually was Ireland losing to New Zealand in the quarterfinal of the World Cup. Just, 7 or 8 months ago? It was one of the very few occasions where I thought, I can't watch this sport again. It was devastating. I thought, it was largely because I think of the opportunity that was there, you know. I think the opportunity was that Ireland could have actually won that World Cup, and they came so close. And for a single match to turn on a few such key incidents, that was a tough one.
Oh my gosh, I wasn't right for quite a while after that. I have to say, it was so tough. And I think as well, going back to legacy, it's always really tough when there's a big loss, when you know that players are retiring, because you know that they're not going to get that chance again. It's like even more emotional, I think, because obviously the World Cup only comes around every couple of years.
But that's the point. You see, your question was what's the most emotional, and I think, you know, it was bad enough. And then Andy Farrell went up and said, "This is kind of the end of this team," because clearly Sexton was moving on. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, could he have made it any worse? But you knew exactly what he was saying.
Yeah, he kind of put salt in the wound. Probably didn't mean to, but anyway, you made a couple of projects now about boxers in particular. And I'm really curious to know what part of the intrigue of boxers, particularly kind of before the modern social media excessive promotion phase that we're in now, what part did that play in drawing you to making projects about these people?
You know, the phrase excessive promotion, people think that's a social media thing, right? It's tied into my answer, I suppose. What drew me into boxing really was there's an old cliche. If you speak to any boxing historian, the golden age of boxing was the 1920s, and then equally cliched is the comma, and what comes after that is, and it was also the golden age of sports writing. And people argue as to whether, you know, the great age of boxing made the sports writers, or whether the sports writers themselves actually made boxing. And you know, people talk about influencing these days and social media. These guys were in a different league. I mean, the quality of the writing, the way that boxers were promoted in those days, the sophistication behind the writing, the quality of the writing. You know, anybody who thinks themselves an influencer today, they are seriously minor league compared to these characters. And that's where really my kind of interest in this began. I mean, the 1920s were extraordinary, and the way these people wrote about the sport, and that was really my entry point, I think.
I wonder then what you're how do you feel about it now? You know, I mean, where do you go, I suppose, for your boxing commentary these days? Or are there places that anywhere that you feel has kind of retained that essence of the reporting as how it started out?
Not the reporting. I think that the sporting endeavour is still there, and I think the challenge really is that these guys were turning out copy. They were sitting in Madison Square Garden, writing with old-fashioned, you know, typewriters and phoning in copy to, you know, as the rounds went by, and the quality of the writing is amazing. And I think, you know, the boxers haven't changed. So the key is can you apply the skills and the storytelling skills to modern day stories that these guys did, who technically didn't have anything like the privileges that we do.
Yeah, very true. And you kind of touched on it there, boxers haven't changed. I think I was reading another interview that you had done, and you made a really interesting point that you have to avoid turning the sports people into characters. And I think, having seen One Night in Millstreet myself at the SIF premiere, and sitting there 2 rows behind Steve Collins and his family, and kind of feeling the atmosphere that was just even in the theatre that night, not to mind to say at the actual boxing match. How hard is it to kind of pare it back and make sure that you don't get into the kind of characterization area when you are dealing with these kind of stories? Because Collins and of course Eubank, they have such charisma, they're such interesting people.
I think, again, actually going back to these guys, the likes of Paul Gallico, Damon Runyon, Grant and Rice, they redefined the skill in terms of commenting and writing on sports, and therefore I suppose what you do is you take that journalistic exercise and you apply it to your own era. I mean, I wasn't at a Jack Dempsey fight; they were in the 1920s. But what you can do is you can sit down, you can read what these guys wrote, and you can hopefully aspire to being anything like that good. And what they did was, even though it was you mentioned social media earlier on and influencing. I mean, this was the age of no decision boxing. No decision boxing is really important because in most of the states in the United States, and boxing was really an American story back then, gambling was outlawed. And so therefore, boxing matches couldn't have a decision because they thought that this would influence the betting market. So they came up with this no decision idea. And the idea was that by not having the referee or the judges cast a decision, you couldn't therefore corrupt the betting market. But the way they found the way around that was actually, they said, well, we're not going to have a decision here. Unless somebody knocks somebody else out, it's a no decision fight. But then, of course, what the bookmakers did was they picked the winner based upon the guy that the newspaper reporters at ringside believed had won the fight. Okay, so that's where a lot of this writing comes in. And therefore, this idea of boosting fighters, of hyping fighters, that's where it all comes from. And I suppose when you're looking then at modern day characters, I mean, Eubank is a great example of this. Sky Sports essentially took, I don't think they did it consciously, but they looked at the way that boxers were being sold, if you like, in the 1920s. And they applied that to Chris Eubank. He was a massive marketing ploy in the 1990s. I mean, I'm sitting in my mum's house at the moment, and I remember putting a satellite dish on the roof of this house so that my granddad could watch Chris Eubank lose. And that's how they sold satellite dishes, People didn't buy dishes to watch Chris Eubank win. They built him up as the pantomime villain to see him lose, okay? And I suppose if you can look at fights through the prism in the same prism as these guys were writing about in the 20s, I think then that helps you tell a modern story, but maybe in a more objective manner.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well, the footage, and I suppose the reflectiveness that Eubank showed, I think, during One Night in Millstreet was really interesting because he was very much portrayed, as you say, as this pantomime villain, and he certainly played up to that as well, his behaviour in and out of the ring. And it's interesting to see him then sort of sit down and say, yeah, I was beaten at the end of the day, and here is why I think, Steve Collins beat me. And how was that for you, being such a boxing fan, really knowing your history of the sport, to sort of experience someone of his stature say, yeah, I lost, and at the end of the day, I wasn't the best fighter in there. How was that experience for you?
Well, interviewing Eubank was an absolute career highlight. But I mean, for example, at the moment, okay, we're in the middle of the Olympics, and I really feel for these guys because they either win or they lose, they qualify or they don't, and they've trained for years and years and years. And then if somebody come up and they thrust the microphone into their faces and they say, "How do you feel?" And I mean, it's such a ridiculous kind of question. Either they've won or they've lost. Okay, so and then you have the classic question is, you have 60,000 people cheering you on. How do you feel? And I mean, it's such a daft kind of question. But in some ways, you see, I think that's the difference between documentary, I suppose, and news. Okay, so I mean, we had 20 to 25 years. So basically, when I was interviewing Chris Eubank, I was 30 years removed from that night. Now, you clearly lose something. You lose the spontaneity, right? But I suppose, what does spontaneity even give you? Because these guys have trained and, they're absolutely hyped up for this event. How can they possibly be reflective as the moment unfolds? They can't, And so in some ways, I suppose what I'm doing is forgiving sports reporters who just shove a microphone in somebody's face and say, "How do you feel?" Right? I'm not actually forgiving them. It's a shocking sin. But it's kind of it. What I'm saying is that I think that documentary maybe is a far better medium to actually answer the question, "How do you feel?" Because I think they only know how they feel 25 or 30 years later.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was just having this conversation yesterday about Kelly Harrington. She came out having won her semi-final bout, and one of the first questions that she was asked was, how are you going to start preparing for the final? And I just thought, and she had the presence of mind to say, "I don't know who it is, like, please don't tell me." She was very intentional and very measured about it. But I just thought, what an awful thing to, kind of take away the euphoria of that win by saying immediately you need to look at your next competitor, when in reality, even just getting to that point was such an achievement. It seemed cruel almost to take that moment away from her.
And I think there are so many better questions that could be asked as well. I mean, because it's fascinating. What these people go through is fascinating. That's why sports are so compulsive. That's why the viewing figures are off the charts. I mean, you look at RTE's viewing figures for all the All-Ireland finals this year. They're unbelievable. And because there's an inherent drama in there. And I think it's kind of like, you'd never sort of script a movie and the hero kind of wins in the end, which you kind of know he's always going to do, and then ask him how he feels.
Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. They seem to be getting away with it at the moment, so we'll see. I'd love to know, obviously there's, the boxers themselves, and then there's the teams around them, which actually I'd love to know from your own historical knowledge, whether the teams around boxers have always been quite so robust. But I suppose the question is, I'd like to think of parallels between the art and the sport, and I always think of, I suppose, a director, similar role to a coach in some scenarios. So are there any learnings that you've taken from coaches you've met during filming projects that you think you've taken into your role as a director or could translate across those two things?
I think directors are more similar to team captains than they are to coaches. I think that basically your job really is to just make on-the-fly decisions on the field. And I certainly don't think you're the manager. I really don't think that's the job. I not even team captain. I think, for me, the closest comparison would be to be wearing the 10 shirt on a rugby pitch. I think what you do is you basically you're the guy who has to respond to the circumstances as they change, right? So, I suppose, if you've got a dodgy director of photography, then suddenly you're relying on your archive researcher to sort of fill the gap. Not that I've ever had a dodgy director of photography. It's a hypothetical point. But I think that's what it is. I think that, it's kind of, it is being on the field. You keep morale up, you make decisions on the hoof, and that's, that then translates to the edit suite. And I suppose the team sport thing is important. I mean, I've known loads of kind of guys, especially now that, technology has really democratized documentary making, and, you can shoot your own stuff and you can edit your own stuff. That's not a game I'm technically able to play, to be perfectly frank. If anybody's relying on me to shoot anything, you're not going to see much at the end of the day. Likewise, editing, it would be a terribly self-indulgent kind of process. And so for me, documentary making is a team sport. And I'm certainly not the manager, but I might just be wearing the number 10 shirt.
Amazing. I like that. I like that comparison. And just going back to that point about the coaching teams around boxers, back in the 20s, what did that kind of look like? Did they still have, I mean, now it's like multiple people in your corner. There's kind of hype men at this point around, men and women, actually, it has to be said, around these boxers. How has that developed over the years?
I think, as in every other sport, what has developed is the sports science. I mean, the nutritionists are new, and, the fitness and conditioning people are new. The manager's job, I don't think, has changed a huge amount. I mean, there was a guy called Tex Rickard, who was this legendary American boxing impresario of the 1910s and 20s. I can see Tex Rickards everywhere these days. I mean, you can just see them, and they spin their webs and they put the formulas together, and they hype the fighters and they make the matches. I don't think that art form has changed hugely. I think the boxers are better trained, they're better coached, they're certainly better prepared. But yeah, I think the art of the deal, as Trump would say, is still the same.
Interesting. I was watching an interview with an actor recently who was asked about, there was a particularly intense scene that they were filming, and they were asked, how did you get through multiple takes of this scene? And they said, the audience doesn't care. They just expect you to get it done because what they see is the finished product. And I started thinking about the pressure that sports fans put on sports people. And I think it's really interesting in boxing because while there are many sports that are physical, boxing has, there's over the years, particularly before the sports science, as you mentioned, got better, there's real damage being done to these people. What do you think, or where do you think that sort of mindset comes from, that they can get in the ring knowing that these things are possible? Do they just have to block that out? Like, it's a lot of sacrifice, potential sacrifice at least.
In some ways, that was kind of one of the spinal stories, I think, in Millstreet. I mean, it was the context, of course, of the fight was, first of all, you had Ray Close, who was supposed to be taking the fight, who had been stripped of his license because he'd failed an MRI scan. So that was part of the backstory. And then they needed to find, and it's only because of that they needed, the fight was fixed for Ireland, and it was fixed for St. Patrick's Day weekend. So then they need to find an Irishman to fight Eubank. That was the purpose of the tour. And so Eubank then goes away and prepares for this fight. And then there's the Ben McClellan fight, which is one of the most well-publicized boxing accidents, I suppose, in history, because I'm not sure what the viewing figures were, but they were north of 10 million on ITV, watching a guy essentially being brain damaged live on television. So this was unbelievably stark. I mean, we haven't witnessed anything like that for a very long time, and but they were different times. I mean, we used to see drivers die in Formula One races not that long ago. Technology means that we haven't seen that for a few years, but it's kind of funny, really, what live television shows us these days. It's not that it's sanitized. I think just sports have got on board with health and safety, I suppose. But health and safety only takes you so far in boxing. It really does. It takes you to a certain point. It's far better than it was. But one of the challenges with Millstreet was to convey the fact that this was 1995, not 2015. And it was a different world. And there was a real sense of danger. And I think there was a real sense of danger that night.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I can only kind of admire from afar, how they do it, especially when you consider that in other sports, football, rugby as well, nowadays when there is a very dangerous injury in live play, the director will they'll pan to the crowd, or they'll go back to the studio. There'll be a sort of avoidance of any kind of traumatic injury, whereas with boxing, you can't avoid it because it's happening in the moment. There's no sort of time to react, really, I suppose.
That's interesting, isn't it? I hadn't thought of that. You're right. Because if you think about professional rugby, we started the conversation talking about, rugby in the amateur days, and it was a completely different game, completely different. People were half the size to begin with, and there was no cutting away, there's no sanitizing, and it's a really interesting idea. I hadn't even thought about it, because you're right, live television, certainly at rugby matches these days, if there's a really nasty head injury, they cut away. And it's only after somebody's deemed to be okay that then they repeat the incident that caused the injury in the first place. But of course, the problem is that what we don't know at the moment is how cumulative maybe that is, and that maybe if somebody's okay instantly, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, is that footage going to be far more poignant maybe than it is in real time?
Yeah, certainly. Absolutely. Again, I suppose going back to the inherent sacrifices and, the way these people put their bodies on the line, it's incredible. Closing question, I should say, for each guest is whether there's a rule, a ritual, or a regulation that you would try to cross over from boxing to directing. Now, that's quite a stark, it's quite a stark transition, but I'm curious to know if you thought of any.
It's a good question. Maybe what we should have, right, we talked about sort of fight hypes. Maybe when these funding rounds are decided as to who gets, BAI funding or Screen On funding, maybe we should have weigh-ins, where rival directors are facing off at press conferences and kind of staring each other out. That would be good. I'd kind of quite enjoy that. But I suppose rituals, I suppose the only thing that really kind of strikes me is that the only thing I think that crosses over from sports to filmmaking is, I suppose, discipline. I think that when you watch a really good documentary made by somebody who clearly has taken the craft seriously and who is really disciplined, and you can tell the way it's been shot, the way it's been cut, I think that there is that real sense of discipline in the performance, pride in the performance. Again, it's a cliche. You often hear sports people say that it's not the winning or the losing, it's the performance. And if they performed, no, I don't believe that for a second. but I think there's an element in there that if you believe you've performed to your best and that you've not left anything out there, and I suppose, from a documentary point of view, I suppose you've not left anything on the cutting room floor, that you've given it your best shot, that you've essentially been disciplined enough to tell the truth as you see it, and that it's an honest portrayal of what you're trying to convey, then that's as good as it gets.
For sure, absolutely agree. Before I let you go, I want to hear about anything you've got coming up next. I know when we first connected, you were just wrapping a project. So I'd love to know if there's anything you can share with listeners that might want to keep an eye out for future work.
Yeah, I mean, we just finished shooting a second series for RTE about the National Archives. It's called The Record Show with Katie Hannon. So that's in the can. But the next one after that is kind of extremely exciting. My next Zoom call actually is with the Environment Minister in Greenland, and we're shooting a series on the demise of the Atlantic salmon. And it's all very exciting, and I know nothing much about fishing. I probably know less about fish than I do about fishing, but I'll kind of catch up. But it's really a climate change thing, and the way that maybe the demise of the Atlantic salmon is going to tell us a lot about climate change and the environment and the world we live in, and that it might be this sort of canary in the mine species, and it's going to take me from northern Spain to Greenland, and for that reason alone, it's very exciting.
Wow, yeah, quite a journey. Amazing. I'm excited to see that. We're going to leave it there for this episode, but Andrew, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.